At 94 years old, Clint Eastwood is still directing films, not out of passion, not for money, but because stopping means facing something he's spent his entire life avoiding. Silence. 5 Oscars. 50 films as director. 7 decades of cinema. The man who turned silence into menace, who made the Western an immortal myth, who became the very definition of American masculinity. Dirty Harry. The man with no name. William Money. Characters that never die. But there's a price Hollywood doesn't show. 7 children scattered across 5 different women. Marriages destroyed. Kids kept secret for years. Lovers who became lawsuits. And a loneliness so deep that friends whisper, Clint doesn't know who he is if he's not working. The lone cowboy conquered everything. But conquering everything means losing what? How did the actor Hollywood swore would never be a star build an empire from rejection and ice? And why did a man who created films about human connection never learn to connect himself? Before we answer, we need to go back. Long before the Oscars. Long before Dirty Harry. To the years when Clint Eastwood was invisible, rejected, and considered too slow to ever matter. Because the legend began in the most unlikely place. Absolute defeat. Clint Eastwood's first stage was not a soundstage bathed in Hollywood lights, but the back roads of Depression-era America, where survival meant constant motion and stability was a luxury no one could afford. Born May 31, 1930, in San Francisco, he arrived into a country collapsing under economic ruin. His father, Clinton Sr., a manufacturing worker and steelworker, chased disappearing jobs across California, like a man hunting ghosts. His mother, Margaret Ruth, held the family together with sheer will, moving from town to town, school to school, never settling long enough for roots to take hold. By the time Clint reached his teens, he had lived in Sacramento, Pacific Palisades, Piedmont, and a dozen forgotten towns in between. Each new school meant new faces that never became friends, new teachers who never remembered his name. He was always the new kid, always on the margins, always invisible. I was shy, really shy, he would later admit, a confession that seems impossible for the man who would one day stare down outlaws and corrupt cops without flinching. I didn't fit in anywhere. I was just there. At Oakland Technical High School, Clint was the tall, awkward kid in the back row. Not the athlete, not the scholar, not the charmer. He scraped through classes, worked odd jobs, gas stations, lumber yards, firefighting crews during summers, and learned early that no one was coming to save him. If he wanted anything, he would have to take it himself. At 21, the draft came. The Korean War was raging, and Clint Eastwood, who had barely figured out what he wanted from life, suddenly found himself in uniform. He was assigned to Fort Ord in California, not shipped overseas to freezing trenches and gunfire, but the experience marked him. The military didn't make him a warrior. It made him disciplined, patient, and quietly observant. It was during a military swim that death came close. A Navy bomber plane he was aboard crashed into the Pacific. Clint and the pilot had to swim miles through freezing water to reach shore. Years later, he would recall it with eerie calm. I just kept swimming. What else could I do? That phrase, what else could I do, would become the silent mantra of his entire life. When Clint returned to Los Angeles in 1953, he was 23, directionless, and working construction and odd jobs to survive. Hollywood was a distant dream, a shimmering mirage visible from the valley but impossibly far. He had no training, no connections, no money. What he did have was height, a lean frame, and a face that seemed carved from stone. A cameraman at Universal noticed him and suggested he try acting. It sounded absurd. Clint had never acted, never even considered it. But desperation opens doors, ambition never could. He enrolled in acting classes at Los Angeles City College, studying alongside others just as hungry, just as invisible. Universal Pictures signed him to a contract in 1954. It should have been the breakthrough. Instead, it became 7 years of humiliation. He was cast in forgettable bit parts, a lab assistant here, a Navy pilot there, a cowboy with 2 lines of dialogue. Roles so small his scenes were often cut before the film even premiered. Directors found him stiff. Producers found him slow. Executives whispered he would never be a star. One particularly brutal assessment, delivered by a Universal casting director, became legend. You have a chip on your tooth, your Adam's apple sticks out too far, and you talk too slow. The message was clear. You don't belong here. In 1955, Universal dropped his contract. Clint Eastwood, now 25, was back to nothing. While James Dean was burning bright and Marlon Brando was rewriting the rules of screen acting, Clint was just another tall, awkward nobody Hollywood had chewed up and forgotten. He took small TV roles, guest spots on Highway Patrol, Navy Log, bit parts that paid barely enough to cover rent. His wife, Maggie Johnson, whom he had married in 1953, worked to keep them afloat. Some nights, Clint admitted later, he wondered if he was chasing a fantasy that would never arrive. But he didn't quit. Not because he believed in himself, he wasn't sure he did, but because he genuinely didn't know what else to do. Acting was all he had left. Then, in 1958, came the audition that would change everything. Rawhide, a TV Western looking for a young, rugged cowboy to play second fiddle to the lead star. Clint tested. He didn't dazzle. He didn't charm. He just stood there, quiet and steady. And somehow, that was enough. He was cast as Rowdy Yates, the ramrod on a cattle drive. For 7 seasons and 217 episodes, Clint rode across black and white prairies, learning his craft in front of millions of viewers who barely noticed him. He was not the star. He was dependable, invisible, exactly where Hollywood wanted to keep him. But inside, something was shifting. Watching directors work, studying camera angles, absorbing the rhythm of storytelling, Clint was no longer just acting. He was learning how to build a career on his own terms. By 1964, Rawhide was fading, and Clint Eastwood, now 34, was facing obsolescence. TV cowboys were dying out. Movies wanted method actors, not stiff ranch hands. He had survived poverty, rejection, and years of invisibility. But Hollywood's verdict remained unchanged. Clint Eastwood would never be a star. That verdict was about to be shattered by a cigar, a poncho, and a director in Italy who saw something no one else could. In 1964, when Sergio Leone called with an offer to star in a low-budget Western to be shot in the deserts of Spain, every agent and executive in Hollywood had the same advice for Clint Eastwood. Don't do it. Italian Westerns were considered jokes. Cheap knockoffs with dubbed dialogue, ridiculous plots, and production values barely above home movies. Going to Europe to make a spaghetti Western wasn't a career move, it was career suicide. Stars didn't go to Italy to become famous. They went there to disappear. Clint's agent begged him to reconsider. His colleagues on Rawhide told him he was throwing away his TV career. Even his wife questioned the decision. But Clint saw something no one else did: an opportunity to escape the box Hollywood had built around him. For $15,000 and a plane ticket, Clint Eastwood flew to Spain to meet a director who spoke no English and shoot a Western unlike anything America had ever seen. A Fistful of Dollars was brutal, stylized, and stripped of everything traditional Westerns held sacred. There were no noble sheriffs or moral speeches, just violence, silence, and a nameless stranger in a poncho who killed without remorse and disappeared like smoke. Leone's direction was revolutionary. Extreme close-ups on Clint's eyes, long wordless stretches filled only with Ennio Morricone's haunting score, gunfights choreographed like opera. And Clint, the actor Hollywood called too stiff, suddenly became magnetic precisely because of his stillness. He didn't act. He was. Every squint carried threat. Every silence screamed danger. The man with no name didn't need dialogue. His presence was the story. When A Fistful of Dollars premiered in Italy in 1964, it became a sensation. Europe went wild. But in America, the film didn't even get distribution. Hollywood dismissed it as foreign garbage, beneath serious consideration. Leone immediately cast Clint in 2 more films, For a Few Dollars More in 1965, and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly in 1966. Each one bigger, bolder, more epic than the last. By the time the Dollars trilogy concluded, Clint Eastwood was a superstar across Europe, worshipped in Italy, France, and Germany, while still virtually unknown in his own country. Then, in 1967, United Artists finally released A Fistful of Dollars in American theaters. The impact was seismic. Audiences who had grown tired of sanitized cowboys suddenly witnessed something raw and visceral. The westerns of John Wayne and Gary Cooper felt like relics. This was something primal. Overnight, Clint Eastwood went from washed-up TV actor to the most exciting presence in American cinema. The industry that had rejected him now scrambled to sign him. Offers flooded in, scripts piled up, and Clint, who had spent 15 years invisible, suddenly couldn't walk down a street without being recognized. But he didn't celebrate. He strategized. While other actors chased paychecks, Clint studied the machine. He learned about budgets, schedules, and how studios controlled talent through contracts and fear. He watched directors and took notes, and he made a quiet vow: never be powerless again. In 1968, he formed his own production company, Malpaso, ensuring he would never again be at the mercy of executives who once told him he had no future. It was an unprecedented move for an actor. Most didn't dare challenge studio control. But Clint wasn't most actors. Then came 1971, and the role that would define American cinema for a generation: Dirty Harry. Inspector Harry Callahan was the anti-hero America didn't know it needed. A cop who despised bureaucracy, ignored rules, and delivered justice with a .44 Magnum and ice-cold one-liners. "Do you feel lucky? Well, do ya, punk?" became more than a catchphrase. It became a cultural earthquake. Dirty Harry exploded. It wasn't just a hit. It was a phenomenon. Conservatives loved Harry's hard justice. Liberals condemned the film as fascist. Critics were divided. Audiences didn't care. They packed theaters to watch Clint Eastwood deliver vigilante justice with a smirk and a raised eyebrow. 4 sequels followed, each one a box office titan. By the mid-1970s, Clint Eastwood was the highest-paid actor in the world, commanding $5 million per film, an astronomical sum at the time. But while most stars would have settled into comfortable celebrity, Clint was restless. Acting was never enough. He had spent too many years watching directors fumble scenes, waste time, and bloat budgets. He knew he could do better. In 1971, the same year Dirty Harry premiered, Clint stepped behind the camera for the first time to direct Play Misty for Me, a taut psychological thriller he also starred in. It was a gamble. Actors turned directors were often ridiculed, their films dismissed as vanity projects. Play Misty for Me was a critical and commercial success. Clint had proved he could direct. More importantly, he proved he could direct well, efficiently, under budget, ahead of schedule, with no ego tantrums or wasted takes. Over the next decade, Clint would direct and star in film after film: High Plains Drifter, The Outlaw Josie Wales, The Gauntlet, Escape from Alcatraz. Some succeeded, some stumbled, but Clint never stopped working, never stopped learning, never stopped building his empire brick by brick. By 1980, Clint Eastwood was no longer just a star. He was an institution, a man who had gone from rejected TV cowboy to the most powerful actor-director in Hollywood. But power, as Clint would soon discover, does not shield you from loneliness, scandal, or the brutal unraveling of the very things you thought were solid. The myth of the lone cowboy was about to face its cruelest test, not on screen, but in the wreckage of his private life. Behind the granite face that made Clint Eastwood a legend stood a private life fractured by secrets, infidelities, and relationships that imploded under the weight of a man who could never stop moving, never stop working, never truly let anyone in. In 1953, when Clint married Maggie Johnson, he was a 23-year-old nobody working construction and dreaming of impossible stardom. She was a college student who believed in him when no one else did. For the first struggling years, they were partners, Maggie working to pay bills while Clint chased bit parts and humiliating rejections. But as fame arrived, so did distance. By the 1960s, Clint was spending months on location, surrounded by actresses, stunt women, and the intoxicating freedom of being wanted. Maggie stayed home. Clint stayed gone. The affairs began quietly. In 1964, while filming Rawhide, Clint met Roxanne Tunis, a stunt woman and dancer. What started as a fling became a shadow relationship that lasted 14 years. In 1964, Roxanne gave birth to a daughter, Kimber. Clint acknowledged the child privately, provided financial support, but kept her existence hidden from the public and, for years, from Maggie. Kimber grew up knowing her father only through brief, secret visits. A man who appeared, played dad for an afternoon, then vanished back into his other life. "I always felt like a secret," Kimber would later admit, a devastating confession that revealed the cost of being born into Clint's carefully compartmentalized world. Maggie discovered the affair, discovered Kimber, but stayed. Divorce in Hollywood carried stigma, and Maggie still hoped the man she married might return. He never did. By the 1970s, Clint's infidelities were an open secret on every set he worked. Then came Sandra Locke, an actress he met on the set of The Outlaw Josie Wales in 1975. She was married. He was married. Neither seemed to care. Sandra left her husband. Clint left Maggie, though the divorce wouldn't finalize until 1984. For 13 years, Clint and Sandra lived together, co-starred in 6 films, and presented themselves as Hollywood's unconventional power couple. But behind the glamour, the relationship was deeply troubled. Sandra later alleged that Clint was controlling, dismissive of her career, and emotionally abusive. She claimed he pressured her into having 2 abortions and undergoing a tubal ligation. Promises of marriage always delayed, always conditional. While with Sandra, Clint fathered 2 more children, Scott, born 1986, and Catherine, born 1988, with flight attendant Jaslyn Reeves. He kept these children secret from Sandra, from the press, from everyone. When Sandra finally discovered the truth, the betrayal shattered her. In 1989, after 13 years together, Clint abruptly ended the relationship. He changed the locks on their shared home while she was away. No warning, no conversation. Just eviction. Sandra sued. The palimony case became a media spectacle, airing accusations of manipulation, broken promises, and a man who compartmentalized his life so thoroughly that entire children could exist in separate, hidden boxes. The case settled quietly in 1996, reportedly for over $1 million. But the damage was public and permanent. Clint's image as the stoic, honorable hero cracked. The man who played righteous cowboys on screen stood accused of callousness in real life. Yet even as the lock scandal raged, Clint had moved on. In 1990, he met actress Frances Fisher on the set of Pink Cadillac. By 1993, they had a daughter, Francesca. The relationship seemed different, more stable, more public. But once again, the pattern held. Clint's work came first. Always, directing consumed him, scripts piled up. 18-hour days became routine. Frances, like Maggie before her, found herself loving a man who was always present in body, but absent in soul. By 1995, the relationship collapsed. Frances later spoke carefully about those years, choosing words with the precision of someone who still carried wounds, but refused to pour salt. "He's a man married to his work," she said simply. In 1996, at 66 years old, Clint married for the second time Dina Ruiz, a television news anchor 35 years his junior. They had a daughter, Morgan, in 1996. For a while, it seemed Clint had finally found stability. But the marriage lasted only 17 years. In 2013, Dina filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. Friends whispered the same old story. Clint's obsession with work, his emotional unavailability, the impossibility of competing with scripts and editing bays for his attention. By the time the divorce finalized in 2014, Clint Eastwood had 7 confirmed children from 5 different women, 2 divorces, countless affairs, and a trail of broken relationships spanning 6 decades. Those who worked with him saw the pattern clearly. "Clint doesn't do intimacy," one longtime colleague admitted. "He does control. And when you can't be controlled, he moves on." It wasn't cruelty, exactly. It was something colder, compartmentalization so complete that entire human lives could be filed away in separate drawers, opened only when convenient, closed when they demanded too much. His children, scattered across decades and relationships, grew up with vastly different experiences of the same father. Some, like Scott, followed him into acting and found mentorship. Others, like Kimber, spent years reconciling the public legend with the distant man who visited only when schedules allowed. "My father," one of his children said in an interview, choosing anonymity to speak freely, "was always working. Even when he was home, he was working. You learned not to expect more." And perhaps that is the most haunting truth of Clint Eastwood's private life. Not that he was a villain, but that he was absent. A man so consumed by the need to build, to create, to prove the doubters wrong, that he never learned how to stop long enough to let anyone truly reach him. The cowboy who needed no one had built exactly the life he wanted. Powerful, autonomous, untouchable. But power, autonomy, and impenetrability come with a price. And that price is paid in wedding rings discarded, children who grow up as secrets, and lovers who learn too late that loving Clint Eastwood means loving a ghost. By the late 1980s, Clint Eastwood had become something Hollywood dreaded. Predictable. The man who once revolutionized the Western and redefined the action hero was now recycling himself. Formulaic cop movies like The Rookie and Pink Cadillac felt tired. Critics who once called him magnetic now called him monotonous. Box office returns were shrinking. Younger action stars like Sylvester Stallone, Arnold Schwarzenegger, and Bruce Willis dominated theaters with explosions and one-liners. At 60, Clint Eastwood seemed like a relic, a cowboy who had outlived his era, stubbornly riding into a sunset that had already disappeared. Industry insiders began writing his obituary. "Eastwood is finished," one executive reportedly said. "He's too old, too slow, and nobody cares about westerns anymore." But Clint had spent his entire life proving doubters wrong. And in 1992, he delivered not just a comeback, but a masterpiece that would redefine his legacy forever. Unforgiven. Unforgiven wasn't just another Western. It was a funeral for everything Westerns had pretended to be. No noble gunslingers, no heroic showdowns, just broken men haunted by violence, clinging to myths they no longer believed. Clint played William Money, an aging killer who had buried his guns and his past, trying desperately to live clean on a failing pig farm. When violence calls him back, he discovers that redemption is a lie and that some sins stain too deep to ever wash away. The film was dark, morally complex, and brutal in its honesty. It deconstructed every cowboy Clint had ever played: the man with no name, Dirty Harry, Josie Wales, and asked a question Hollywood had avoided for decades. What happens to killers when the cameras stop rolling? Warner Brothers was nervous. Test audiences found it slow and depressing. Executives wanted reshoots, wanted a clearer hero, wanted Clint to be Clint again. He refused. Unforgiven premiered in August 1992 to stunned reviews. Critics who had dismissed Clint for years suddenly saw him as an artist. The film wasn't just good, it was profound. Audiences, expecting a typical Eastwood shoot-'em-up, instead witnessed a meditation on violence, aging, and regret. The box office was strong, but the real earthquake came in 1993, when Unforgiven swept the Academy Awards. Best Picture, Best Director, Best Supporting Actor for Gene Hackman, Best Editing, 4 Oscars. Clint Eastwood, the actor once told he talked too slow and would never be a star, stood on stage holding the Best Director trophy. At 62, he had done what few actors ever achieve. He had forced the industry to see him not as a commodity, but as a filmmaker. The victory was more than professional. It was personal vindication. Every rejection, every sneer, every year of invisibility, all of it had led to this moment. But Clint didn't rest. While other directors might have coasted on Oscar glory, he doubled down. Over the next 2 decades, he directed film after film, each one probing deeper into themes of loss, regret, and the cost of violence. Mystic River, in 2003, examined childhood trauma and how pain echoes across lifetimes. Sean Penn and Tim Robbins both won Oscars for their shattering performances under Clint's restrained direction. Then came $1 Million Baby, in 2004, a boxing film that wasn't about boxing at all, but about surrogate family, impossible choices, and mercy in the face of unbearable suffering. Clint directed, scored, and starred opposite Hilary Swank in one of the most emotionally devastating films of the decade. When the Academy Awards arrived in 2005, $1 Million Baby dominated. Best Picture, Best Director, Clint's second. Best Actress for Swank. Best Supporting Actor for Morgan Freeman. 4 Oscars. Lightning had struck twice. Clint Eastwood was no longer just respected. He was revered. The same critics who once mocked him now wrote essays analyzing his visual minimalism, his refusal of melodrama, his trust in silence. In 2006, he did something even bolder. He directed Flags of Our Fathers and Letters from Iwo Jima, two companion films about the Battle of Iwo Jima, one from the American perspective, one from the Japanese. Letters from Iwo Jima, filmed entirely in Japanese with Japanese actors, became one of the most acclaimed war films ever made. It earned Clint his fifth Oscar nomination for Best Director at age 76. The irony was almost too perfect. The man who built his career playing American heroes was now humanizing America's enemies, refusing easy patriotism, demanding audiences see war through the eyes of those we once demonized. Over the next 15 years, Clint continued. Gran Torino in 2008, American Sniper in 2014, Sully in 2016, Richard Jewell in 2019, Cry Macho in 2021. Some soared, some stumbled, but he never stopped. By his 90s, Clint Eastwood had become the elder statesman of American cinema. A living legend, still directing, still working, still refusing to retire. And yet, the artistic depth he achieved on screen stood in stark contrast to the emotional distance he maintained in life. He could craft films of profound empathy, exploring grief and regret with surgical precision. But those closest to him often described a man incapable of the very vulnerability his films demanded. One collaborator put it bluntly, Clint understands human pain intellectually. He can film it beautifully, but he doesn't feel it. Not his own, not others. The contradiction haunted him. His films asked questions about redemption, connection, and the weight of the past. But Clint himself seemed to live as if the past didn't exist. Relationships discarded, children compartmentalized, intimacy avoided. Unforgiven ended with money riding away alone, unable to escape what he had done. In many ways, Clint had become money, a man who had killed his old self, achieved everything he wanted, and yet remained isolated, untouchable, forever alone. Perhaps that was the price of becoming a legend. You transcend humanity, and in transcending it, you lose the very thing that makes life worth living. For decades, Clint Eastwood's politics had been an open secret in Hollywood. Libertarian in philosophy, Republican in registration, fiercely independent in spirit. He supported gun rights, small government, and individual responsibility. He served as mayor of Carmel by the Sea, California, from 1986 to 1988, running on a platform of cutting red tape and protecting local businesses. Most of Hollywood shrugged. Clint was Clint. His films rarely preached. His characters embodied self-reliance and skepticism of authority, values that transcended party lines. Conservatives loved Dirty Harry's vigilante justice. Liberals praised Unforgiven's critique of violence. Everyone could claim him. But in 2012, that fragile neutrality shattered in the most bizarre 12 minutes of Clint Eastwood's public life. On August 30th, 2012, at the Republican National Convention in Tampa, Florida, 82-year-old Clint Eastwood walked onto the stage to endorse Mitt Romney. The crowd erupted. An American icon, the embodiment of rugged masculinity and no-nonsense strength, was about to deliver what everyone assumed would be a powerful, dignified speech. Instead, Clint brought out an empty chair. He placed it center stage and proceeded to have a rambling, improvised conversation with an invisible President Obama sitting in the chair. He criticized Obama's policies, scolded the imaginary president for broken promises, and at one point suggested Obama was telling Romney to go fuck himself. The audience, confused at first, eventually cheered. But watching at home, millions of Americans, including many of Clint's longtime admirers, sat in stunned disbelief. Twitter exploded. Eastwood and empty chair trended worldwide. Memes flooded the internet within minutes. Comedians had material for months. Even conservatives who agreed with Clint's politics cringed at the delivery. The Obama campaign responded with a now iconic tweet, a photo of the president sitting in his official chair with the caption, "This seat's taken." It was a humiliation unlike anything Clint had faced. Not a box office flop, not a bad review, but a public moment so awkward, so widely mocked, that it threatened to eclipse decades of achievement. Democrats who had once admired him felt betrayed. How could the director of letters from Iwo Jima, a film about empathy across enemy lines, reduce political discourse to shouting at furniture? Progressives who loved Million Dollar Baby suddenly saw Clint as another out-of-touch conservative billionaire. Even some Republicans distanced themselves. It was unfortunate, one GOP strategist said diplomatically, the kind of careful language used when your celebrity endorser becomes a liability. Clint didn't apologize. In interviews afterward, he doubled down. If somebody's dumb enough to ask me to go to a political convention and say something, they're gonna have to take what they get, he told the Carmel Pine Cone. It was classic Clint, defiant, unapologetic, utterly unwilling to bend to public pressure. But the damage was done. The controversy exposed a deeper contradiction at the heart of Clint's public image. His most beloved characters, the nameless drifter, Dirty Harry, William Money, Walt Kowalski in Gran Torino, were working-class men battling corrupt systems, fighting for dignity against indifferent elites. Yet Clint himself was a multimillionaire supporting candidates and policies that critics argued hurt the very people his characters represented. Tax cuts for the wealthy, deregulation that favored corporations, opposition to unions. Progressives pointed to the irony with fury. How could the man who directed J. Edgar, a nuanced portrait of institutional power run amok, support unlimited corporate money in politics? How could the filmmaker who showed Japanese soldiers as fully human turn around and mock a sitting president like a prop? Conservatives, meanwhile, celebrated his willingness to speak out in an industry that punished conservative voices. Eastwood has guts, one right-wing commentator wrote. He doesn't care what Hollywood thinks. Both sides were right, and both were missing the point. Clint Eastwood had never asked permission to be anyone's hero. He had spent 70 years doing exactly what he wanted, when he wanted, answering to no one. The empty chair wasn't a calculated political move. It was pure, unfiltered Clint, spontaneous, stubborn, and utterly convinced of his own judgment. But in a polarized America, where every celebrity statement was weaponized, neutrality was no longer possible. By stepping onto that stage, Clint had chosen a side, and in choosing, he lost the half of his audience that had believed he belonged to everyone. His films after 2012 became flashpoints. American Sniper, in 2014, a massive box office success about Navy SEAL Chris Kyle, ignited fierce debate. Was it a patriotic tribute or war propaganda? Conservatives hailed it as a masterpiece. Progressives condemned it as jingoistic. Clint stayed silent, letting the work speak. But the work could no longer speak for itself. Every frame was now filtered through politics. The man who had once been universally admired was now divisive. Box office numbers remained strong, but the cultural unity around his name had fractured permanently. And yet, Clint never wavered. He supported Trump in 2016, though with reservations. He criticized political correctness. He continued to make films about American individualism, law and order, and personal responsibility. To admirers, It was integrity, a man refusing to conform to Hollywood groupthink. To critics, it was stubbornness, an old man clinging to outdated values. Perhaps both were true. What remains undeniable is the cost. Clint Eastwood, who had once been claimed by both sides of the political spectrum, became in his final decades a symbol claimed only by one. The empty chair became his legacy's shadow. A moment of absurdity that revealed a man who had lived his entire life refusing to be anything other than exactly who he was, regardless of who it alienated. In the end, Clint got what he always wanted: total independence. But independence, carried to its extreme, becomes isolation. And isolation, however principled, is still lonely. In 2021, at 91 years old, Clint Eastwood did something almost no one in Hollywood believed possible. He directed, produced, and starred in Cry Macho, a quiet western about an aging rodeo star tasked with bringing a young boy home from Mexico. The film was a box office disappointment. Critics called it slow, sentimental, a shadow of his former work. But those who looked closer saw something else entirely: a meditation on regret, second chances, and the question that haunts every restless soul: when do you finally stop running? In one scene, Clint's character, Mike Milo, tells the boy, "I used to think I had all the answers. Then I got older and realized I don't even know the questions anymore." It felt less like a line from a script and more like a confession. Because at 94, Clint Eastwood is still working, still directing, still refusing to retire, even as his body betrays the willpower that has carried him through 7 decades of cinema. His gait is slower now. His voice, once a gravelly whisper of menace, has softened into something almost fragile. Hearing loss requires him to rely on assistance during shoots. His vision, dimmed by age, makes reviewing dailies a challenge. But his mind remains sharp. On set, he's still the same Clint. No wasted takes, no ego tantrums, no tolerance for inefficiency. "We're burning daylight," he'll say, the exact phrase he's used since the 1970s, as if time itself bends to his discipline. Friends describe him as working not out of passion, but out of fear. Fear of what happens when the cameras finally stop rolling, when the scripts run out, when there's nothing left but silence, and the reckoning that comes with it. Clint doesn't know how to stop, one longtime collaborator admitted. He doesn't know who he is if he's not working. At home in Carmel, California, Clint lives quietly in a sprawling estate overlooking the Pacific. The mansion is filled with artifacts from a life lived large: Oscar statuettes, photographs with presidents and legends, film posters spanning half a century. But the house, friends say, often feels empty. His children visit, some more than others. The relationships are complicated, shaped by decades of absence, secrecy, and emotional distance. Scott Eastwood, now an actor himself, speaks publicly of his father with respect, but keeps a careful distance. "He taught me to be tough," Scott once said. Maybe too tough. Kimber, the daughter born in secret to Roxanne Tunis, has reconnected with Clint in recent years. She speaks of forgiveness, but also of wounds that never fully heal. "You can't get back the years," she said in an interview. "You can only decide what to do with the ones you have left." Clint's youngest children, Morgan, now in her late 20s, have the benefit of a father slowed by age, less consumed by empire building, more willing to simply be. But even they describe a man who struggles with intimacy, who connects through silence rather than words. In 2023, Clint became the oldest person ever nominated for an Academy Award when juror number 2 earned him consideration at 93. He didn't win. He didn't attend. But the nomination itself was a testament. Hollywood had long since stopped trying to write his obituary. Because Clint Eastwood refuses to die. Not yet. Not until the final frame is shot. In interviews, when asked about mortality, Clint deflects with humor. "I'll retire when they nail the coffin shut," he jokes. But beneath the joke lies a truth less funny. The knowledge that stopping means confronting everything he's spent a lifetime outrunning. The broken marriages, the scattered children, the lovers who became lawsuits, the loneliness he dressed up as independence, the ambition that built an empire but left him standing alone in an empty mansion, surrounded by trophies that cannot talk back. His films explored these themes obsessively. William Money riding away alone in Unforgiven, Frankie Dunn drowning in guilt in $1 Million Baby, Walt Kowalski seeking redemption in Gran Torino. Every character a version of Clint himself, men who achieved what they wanted and discovered it wasn't enough. "I think Clint knows," one close friend said quietly. "He knows what he sacrificed. He just doesn't know how to live with it, so he keeps working." And perhaps that is the ultimate tragedy and triumph of Clint Eastwood. He became everything he set out to be: a legend, an icon, a man who bent Hollywood to his will and emerged victorious. He transformed rejection into empire, invisibility into immortality. But along the way, he lost the very things that might have made the victory worth savoring: connection, vulnerability, the ability to stop, breathe, and let someone truly see him. His legacy in cinema is untouchable. 5 Academy Awards, 50 films directed, characters etched into cultural memory. He will be studied, celebrated, and referenced for as long as movies exist. But his personal legacy is fractured. Children who bear his name, but not his presence. Lovers who carry scars. And a man who, even at 94, cannot stop long enough to ask if the ride was worth the cost. And now, the question turns to you. What will you take from Clint Eastwood's story? That relentless ambition can build empires? That discipline and grit can overcome any rejection? Or that even legends are human, flawed, and capable of winning the world while losing themselves? Maybe the lesson is simpler: that success and happiness are not the same thing. That power and connection cannot coexist when one demands everything and the other requires surrender. Clint Eastwood taught us how to make great films, but his life teaches us something harder: that the cowboy who rides alone may reach the horizon first, but he reaches it alone. The cameras will eventually stop. The legacy will remain. And somewhere in Carmel, an old man will sit in the quiet, surrounded by the ghosts of what he built and what he left behind. Because in the end, Clint Eastwood became exactly what he wanted: unforgettable, untouchable, and utterly, irreversibly alone. Share your thoughts below. Subscribe for more untold stories. And remember, the greatest legends are not the ones without flaws, but the ones who show us what ambition costs when we forget to dismount.